In the Old Testament, the book of Ecclesiastes, there's a very familiar passage that begins with the words, "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven." There's a time for this and a time for that. Finally, in verse 7, it says, "A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to be in the world." It didn't say this part. End quote. "A time to be in the world and a time to withdraw from the world." And I found this very interesting Zen story about the nature of life. The Zen story goes that a monk is being chased by a fierce tiger and runs and runs and runs and comes to a cliff, and the tiger is still chasing him. And he sees a vine, so he grabs the vine and starts climbing down the cliff. So the tiger gets to the top and is up there pacing back and forth, growling back and forth. Then he looks down and he sees a tiger at the bottom of the cliff, pacing back and forth, growling. And then he sees, oh my goodness, a mouse gnawing at the vine. And then he sees a strawberry growing right next to him. And he reaches over and he grabs it and he eats it. And that's the end of the story. Now, I take this to mean, I take it because there are many levels of this, but I take this to mean in a sense that our past is chasing us. We're afraid of our future. And all we do is we eat strawberries. For most of us in this life. Or you could take it, the unknown of birth is this great unknown, or the unknown of death is this great unknown, that we're afraid of both these unknowns, and we're here eating strawberries, living in the world. Jesus tells a parable that about being in the world that, in all honesty, most preachers hate. And, I subscribe to a number of services where I can read other people's sermons about various passages or this sort of thing. And the most common about this parable was, this must be a mistake. Because it sounds like Jesus is endorsing using cleverness and craftiness in the world. Let me read you the parable. Jesus told his disciples, this is in Luke 16, "There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give me an account of your management, because you cannot be a manager any longer.' The manager said to himself, 'What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg.' So he thinks, 'I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their homes.' So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' 800 gallons of olive oil,' he replied. Now that's a lot of olive oil, and that's very expensive. The manager told him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. Then he asked the second, 'And how much do you owe?' 1,000 bushels of wheat,' he replied. He told him, 'Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people in the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings.'" Now let me give you a little bit more of an insight into how really clever this was, of this dishonest manager. So he's obviously the manager of an estate for an absentee landlord, in charge of the growing and this and that, whatever agricultural products they're putting out. So what happens is, he gets fired, but nobody knows about it. So before everybody hears about it, he goes around and cuts all these deals. Everybody thinks he's, acting on behalf of his master, because he's been that way for years. What happens is that, first of all, he gets a lot of stuff in fast. He collects a lot of receivables. But secondly, and more importantly, is he's put the master in a very awkward position. The master can't really go around and say, he wasn't acting in my authority, because they'd all say, what do you mean? He's always been acting in your authority. You need to notify me of this. Furthermore, the master is getting all this great PR, this great press. He's like forgiving all these debts. He looks fabulous in the community. And so if he goes back and tries to undo these deals, he looks like a chiseler. So this is why he says, you've acted very, very cleverly here. Now, I'm going to move this into another direction. And this sort of was inspired by, I get a newsletter once a month called Quiet Mind Newsletter. This fellow just writes about various processes of quieting the mind. And he talked in this last newsletter about a very famous psychotherapist, Dr. Albert Ellis, who just died recently at the age of 93. And he sort of, what happens in the 50s, this fellow had been a Freudian psychologist, therapist, and he said, this is worthless, gave it up, and began what he called reality therapy, which also became later involved into what was called rational emotive behavior therapy, which means sort of just dealing with your emotions as they come up rather than trying to dig up the past. But the thesis here, he called it the ABC thesis. He said there's three things that go on. There's A, which stands for an activating event. There's B, which stands for our beliefs. And there's C, which stands for our consequences, the consequences of these beliefs. Most people look at an activating event. Oh, it's raining. I get depressed when it's raining. Okay? They go from the activating event to the consequence. They say, this event causes this. And what he would always say is, no, there are these beliefs that we have that control the consequence. So if you believe that rain causes you to be depressed, you're going to be depressed. If you grew up in the desert and rain is a great blessing, a great time for celebrating, you are going to be delighted. Okay? It's not the event, it's the beliefs. Because we've talked, this is a different way of saying what we've said many, many times here. It's our perception. It's our story, like this. But he takes it on further, and he gets very, very charming euphemisms or acronyms. He says, practice USA, unconditional self-acceptance. Because he says what you need are beliefs that are accepting of yourself, beliefs that are accepting of others. He says UOA, unconditional other acceptance, and ULA, unconditional life acceptance. Just because you break the cycle of going from the event, the activating event, to the experience. You deal with the beliefs. You let them go. You release them. You change them into acceptance, into love. And suddenly rainstorms no longer make you depressed. Or the person acting like a maniac no longer creates a sense of fear or rage or whatever is triggering our behavior. It gives us a way to control that, to stop reacting. Now, the reason I'm bringing this out here is, imagine if this dishonest manager had not been a child of this world, but had been a child of light. Jesus, draws these distinctions. Everyone is in their own world, wherever they are on their path of their own evolution. So, the manager's beliefs here they're just specified there. He says, I can't dig. I'm not too old. I'm too ashamed to beg. So what happens is he goes immediately to the consequence. Had he sat silently in the stillness without these beliefs or setting these beliefs aside, a whole world of opportunity would have opened up to him. It's sort of like, the middle-aged manager today who's downsized and laid off. Some of them go commit suicide. Some of them start new businesses. Some of them get other jobs. There's a whole range of possibilities that can happen. But if the belief is, I'm too old to start something. I'm too old to get a job. Well, guess what? That's going to be the consequence. So, what I want to contrast here is the power of stillness, of silence, versus the power of belief. And there's actually great power in belief. Look how it creates our world. We believe we're going to be depressed. We're going to be depressed when it rains. Okay? But there's far greater possibility in stillness and in silence. And one of the passages that I love sort of describing the power of faith, which is really coming from silence. Because to sit in silence, our beliefs are like our comfort zone. To sit in silence is to have faith that the world will work out. From Mark 6. And he went out from thence and came into his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath day was come, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many hearing him were astonished, saying, From whence hath this man these things? And what wisdom is this which is given unto him, that even such mighty works are wrought by his hands? Is this not Mary, or the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joses, and Judah and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they were offended at him. But Jesus said unto them, A prophet is not without honor, but in his own country, and among his own kin and his own house. And there he could do no mighty work, save that he laid his hands upon a few sick folks and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief, and he went round about the villages teaching. So Jesus, in all of his divine majesty, in all of his power, could do no great works in his own hometown because they could not believe, they could not accept, they could not have faith. Better to say, their beliefs were too strong about him already, that he's just a carpenter, the son of a carpenter. He's just a carpenter. I know his brothers and his sisters. Why should he be able to do this? Basically, no faith, no miracles. No silence, no miracles. Beliefs block that divine energy from flowing forth. There's another story in the Old Testament that sort of ties into this. It's a Kabbalistic interpretation of the story of Joseph. Remember, Joseph has been thrown into the prison, and he interprets the dreams of the wine steward and the baker of the Pharaoh, and basically says to the baker, "You're going to 3 days you'll be hung, you'll be killed," and to the wine steward he says, "In 3 days you'll be free and restored to your former position." Of course, that's just what happened. And as the wine steward is being released, Joseph says to the wine steward, "Remember me to the Pharaoh." Now, the Kabbalists say at that point, Joseph made a huge mistake. Instead of relying on God to release him from this prison, he is putting his hope in the wine steward. He's putting his hope in the world. He's acting like a son of the world. And because of that, he has to stay in that prison for 2 years longer, and then he gets released. And it sounds like a dreadful price to have to pay, but they say Joseph was of such an elevated spiritual nature that if he makes a little mistake like that, he really feels the effects of it immediately. But again, at that moment, Joseph had no stillness, no faith in the divine unfolding of the perfect events in his life. And the Kabbalists will say, if you want to become like God, don't trust the wine steward, or wine, or stewards. That was from, that whole story is from Michael Berg, who translated the Zohar into English. It's quite a phenomenal work. So let's talk a little bit more about silence and stillness. Let's go back deep into the history of it, because it's so interesting. I've been reading this book called Reality. It's written by a professor, I guess a classics professor, down in the University of New Mexico in Santa Fe. And he's going back and finding in all the old Greek writings the earliest philosophers, like the biggest one he can find is Parmenides, who is called the father of modern logic, because he wrote this incredible poem that it really has 3 sections. And the second section is all this great clarity on logic. And so Plato and Aristotle will write about him and try and experience what he experienced and this sort of thing. The problem is that the first and third sections of this poem are total, mystical, almost gibberish. But he's done a wonderful job of translating them properly so we can all understand it. But the history of this is that, and this is all in these ancient Greek writings, is that these ancient Greeks would go into a cave. They were called lords of the lair. so to speak, lords of the cave. They'd lie down in complete stillness, still the body, still the mind, and then walk the path of the dead. Walk into the underworld, walk into the heavens like that. And come back. They all would say this. They'd come back as messengers. They'd say, this is what the gods have said about law. This is what they've said about logic, like this. It's very interesting. They called this period of lying in absolute stillness incubation. So it's a perfect description of the stillness that comes from meditation. They practice what's called hesychia, which shows up in the Christian tradition in the Hesychast movement of the Desert Fathers, the 3rd century, the 200s, where mostly they would take the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, and repeat it over and over and over again. Now, the scholars who write about this today are so careful to try and distinguish it between mantra practice. They say, oh, no, it's not mantras. You have to say it with meaning. But it's really quite clear this is exactly what was going on. And I'll read one of the early instructions, because what they're doing is they're quieting the mind. And all the thoughts that come and torment them are demons. You've heard of the Desert Fathers scourging themselves to get rid of their demons and this sort of thing. These are thoughts that come into their mind when they're trying to experience the stillness, hesychas. So St. John of Sinai described this practice as follows. Take up your seat on a high place and watch, if only you know how. And then you will see in what manner, when, and whence, how many and what kind of thieves come to enter and steal your cluster of grapes. When the watchman grows weary, he stands up and prays. Then he sits down again and courageously takes up his former task. The thoughts or the thieves that are coming in to steal the silence, the stillness. What's very interesting about this, going way back to the Greeks, is that certain of the Greeks absolutely were tied into the Hebrews. Pythagoras, for example, was a Kabbalist. He had all this teachings from the Hebrews. In fact, was sort of derided for it. Other Greeks went to India. There's a colony of Greeks living in Afghanistan, which at the time was part of India. And of course, Alexander went there. And there's all these fun stories. For example, there's one. I think I've told the story before, but I'll tell it again. One Greek sage goes over to Egypt and is chiding the Egyptians for their worshipping of statues. And the Egyptians, with their proud culture of thousands of years, say to him, who are you to tell us Egyptians how to worship? And he says, I'm a Greek who's been to India. And at that, the Egyptians are silent. That's the ancient culture, how everyone ties together. But what I'd like to do is talk about the experience of silence in the Bible. And it's very important, this idea of silence, this stillness, because with this stillness comes peace of mind, comes joy, comes happiness. Probably the greatest story of all in the New Testament is certainly the idea of the stilling of the storm. Jesus has fallen asleep in the boat. The storm is raised up and the boats are in danger of being destroyed. And finally the disciples wake up Jesus and say, Jesus, don't you care? We're about to be destroyed. And Jesus says, peace, be still. Peace, be still. And the storms quiet down again. Water symbolizes emotion. All these emotions that rise up that take us away from peace. Peace, be still. We all have the power to quell storms in our own life. And just acknowledge these storms. Say, yes, this is a storm. Peace, be still. Peace, be still. It's really in the quiet that we accomplish things. The first chapter of Genesis is really a story of silence. Neiman Fox talks about it. He says, the first 6 days symbolize the time when we are to work and do things. And the seventh day is that day of silence, of stillness, that regenerates, that recreates from within. The words of Paul in the letters to the Philippians say, I am sure he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. At the day of Jesus Christ is that day of utter silence, of stillness within. It can be today. It can be tomorrow. That's where we go for that completion. Another story is that of the Red Sea. When the Hebrews are being led by Moses out of Egypt, out of the wilderness, so to speak, and into the desert, the first thing they run into is the Red Sea. And symbolically speaking, that's any obstacle in our own life is the Red Sea. So they're standing there at the Red Sea, and behind them is the army of the Pharaoh. It's sort of like that Buddhist monk, with a Zen monk with tiger above him, tiger below him. What do? And Moses says, fear not. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which God will work for you today. Fear not. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which God will work for you today. And you take that into our own lives. Things that are bothering us. The coworker, the daughter, the whatever it is, the creditor or whatever it is. Instead of reacting, we stand firm. We fear not. And we allow the events to unfold. There's another story. This is the King Jehoshaphat, who he was the king of the southern kingdom of Judea. And at one point, 3 invading armies come at the same time to attack Judea. And of course, Judea didn't have the army to defeat one of them, much less 3 of them. So he goes to the prophet. I don't forget which prophet it is. But the prophet tells Jehoshaphat, basically, fear not. Well, he says, says the same words, fear not. The battle is not yours, but God's. You will not need to fight in this battle. Take your position. Stand still and see the victory of the Lord on your behalf. Fear not. So these 3 armies come. And what happens is 2 of the armies join together and attack the 3rd and destroy it. Then the 2 armies attack each other. And by the time the battle's over, there's no armies left. Okay? So this is where it is. All these things that we see as invading armies, as problems in our lives. This is the B in belief. Okay? If we can let go of that belief, if I don't do something and act in a panic, if we can let go of that acting in a panic and simply sit in stillness and in silence, the world will open up for us. God will fight the battles. The same thing happened with King Hezekiah in 2 Kings. The Syrians had come down, this very great conquering nation at the time, and invaded the southern kingdom again of Judea. They were surrounding Jerusalem. And the chief representative of the Assyrian king was outside the walls, calling and threatening the people and telling them, don't listen to your king Hezekiah, who had told them to sit still and do nothing. He said, come out and surrender to us because you cannot resist the great king of Assyria. This is sort of verbal jihad. He's trying to psych them out and get them to just surrender. But King Hezekiah tells the people, do not answer him. In other words, be quiet. Don't engage in that battle. Just because someone's speaking to you, just because some situation is presenting itself, does not mean we need to respond to it. Be quiet. Do not respond. And you know what happens next? Something happens in the outer. I think in this particular story, a great plague swept through the Syrian army. And so they go out and a couple days later and all the opposing warriors are dead. It's interesting that in this particular time. This is about 700 BC. I forget exactly when it is, about 700 BC. The scholars think that Psalm 46 was written. And that's where that very famous line is. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. So this is not to say never do anything. There are 6 days in the creation story where we do act. But always from that position, utter stillness, utter silence, letting go of the beliefs. And in that, tremendous creation occurs. So let's close our eyes for a moment. And just take a deep breath. Let your attention flow through your body, scanning and finding any tension, any resistance, any feeling of, oh, this won't work for me. Oh, but what about this? Any doubt, any fears that come up when we claim the idea of being still as the ultimate strategy. Being still as being one with God. Any resistance, just let that go. Just breathe into it. Love it. Move your attention into your heart. The heart is still. Be still and know I am God. Be still. Be quiet. Do not answer the many thoughts that arise, the doubts that arise, the fears that arise. Do not answer them. Be still and know that I am God. In our own lives, pick someone or some situation where we have an issue. Maybe it's just a petty thing. Somebody shouldn't have said something. A friend shouldn't have done this. A coworker shouldn't have done this or said that. Or maybe it's a huge thing. We're losing our home. We're losing our bodies. Whatever it is, bring it to the forefront of your attention. Settle back down into the heart. And soften. Soften the heart as you breathe into it. And look at this situation, this person, whatever it is, and just say, I love you. Thank you. I love you. And then go back into your heart and sit in absolute stillness. Hesychia. Stillness. And you may find as you bring this situation to the forefront of your mind, some nagging sensation in your torso. Just let your attention go to that. Love it. Be with it. Let it go. Some gut-wrenching reaction. Some tightening, some clutching in the chest. Thank you. I love you. It's time to be quiet now. Do not fight it. Resist not evil. Thank you, and I love you. Thank you, and I love you. And now in the heart, bring forth the very image of the divine. Bring forth the image of Jesus Christ, or whatsoever image brings you closest to the sense of the divine. Bring it forth. Welcome it forward. And say, thank you, Thank you, Lord, for this stillness, for this quietness, for this complete beingness in my life. Thank you. I give thanks. I give thanks for my life. I give thanks for everything in my life. And I ask your blessings on all that is and all that is not in my life. And now let the energy in your heart move down through your torso, down through your abdominal area, through the pelvis and the legs, down to the shins and down to the feet. Let the feet be firmly planted on the ground, symbolic of that beautiful earth energy, that mother energy in creation. We stand firmly planted in this earth, clothed with the glory of God, and we give thanks. Amen.